On the last episode of Menace, the Ken story. So fast forward to a year later. I was 10 and Kenny was 13. That was the first time that we saw Pops fight Mom. That first fight was followed by many others. Not only that, but some other things started to change too. We didn't only have to worry about crackheads coming to the apartment during the day. We also had people knocking on the door at all hours of the night. We never got a good night's sleep after that point. If Pops didn't get up, the crackheads would knock on me and Kenny's window. One time, this dude actually pushed the screen in and tried to climb inside. Kenny pulled out a bat and went to work on him. At 13 years old, Kenny wasn't ever scared of anything, but I was terrified. At any given time, me and Kenny would come home and some strange person would be waiting at the door, like we were gonna let him in. Pops wouldn't even be there. It's like it never took a day off. Everything in our lives seemed to revolve around Pop selling crack. But then it got worse. I was 11, Kenny was 14. I was so sick that day. But for reasons that I still can't understand, Mom made me go to school. I went to school that day, but I started throwing up probably 2 hours after I got there. School wasn't playing that, of course. So they called Ma at work and made her come and pick me up. Mom spent the whole ride home fussing about how I was making her miss money, like I could help it that I was sick, or like I didn't tell her I was sick before she made me go to school that morning. We stopped by the store to pick up a couple of things, then made our way to the apartment. When we walked in, I picked up a scent that I hadn't ever smelled before. I didn't know what was going on, but Mom knew, and she was hot. She walked towards the bathroom, and I followed, having no idea what we were about to find. She yelled out, "I know you ain't got them niggas smoking crack in my house." Ma flung open the bathroom door to find Pops in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet, all alone, smoking crack. They fought like cats and dogs that day. Kenny wasn't there to get in the middle, so they just went at it. I had to stay home from school the next day because I had a fever. Pops was in the house too. He was smoking crack in the bathroom, off and on, all day. Chapter 4, The Element of Surprise. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. Things got real crazy after Pop started smoking crack. It was one of those things that me and Kenny had to reflect back on and compare it to our memories. I was 9 when we first found the crack in Pop's sock drawer. We had spent months looking at him and Mom for crackhead signs. But 2 years later, we knew for sure that he was smoking crack. I had seen it with my own eyes, and Kenny knew that my word was as good as him having seen it himself. Yet, nothing changed. At first, he still looked and acted like Pops. And in spite of the fact that he was smoking crack, he was still selling crack to the more cracked out crackheads. But if you know anything about crack, you know that you have to be awfully strong to straddle that fence. You're gonna have to either do drugs or sell drugs. It's pretty hard to do both. And when it came down to it, I think Pops was a better doer than he was a seller. And that's how he got beat up. The first time. We were eating dinner when our front door flung open out of nowhere. In my mind, it was the police. I wouldn't have told anybody at that time, but that was a constant fear of mine. That cop show had just come out. In my mind, they were busting in on everybody. But I've come to realize something since then. We had multiple threats in our lives, but they all moved differently. They all moved differently because their motives were different. However, it was always about the element of surprise. The crackheads slithered around because they didn't want to be seen. Their only purpose was to find drugs or something they could sell or exchange for drugs. They moved as quietly as possible. You just got home and your stuff was gone. The police made their presence known when they came through. Best believe they were going to announce themselves. "Police, get down." They moved with authority and caused a commotion because they wanted to let you know who was in charge. They wanted people to be thrown off and fearful. The people who made their way in that night were neither of those. They were 2 well-dressed black men who wore lots of jewelry. They busted in and went straight to the point. Both men had guns. One stood in the doorway while the other walked over to the table where we were seated. Without acknowledging anyone else, the first man spoke to Pops. "You got my money, Chris?" Pops was terrified. I could see it in his face. He addressed the man. "Rob, we said Friday, right?" Without warning, Rob started beating Pops with the gun. Ma stood up and started pleading for the man to stop beating Pops. The second man, who hadn't moved the entire time, walked towards Ma and motioned for her to sit down with his gun. We all watched as Pops got beaten to a pulp. Me and Ma cried. Kenny never even stopped eating. When Rob finished beating Pops, he put his gun in his waistband and walked towards the door. The other man spoke for the first time. He said, "Happy Friday, nigga." That was on a Wednesday. 2 days later, Ma had to give Rob her whole check to keep him from killing Pops. I was 11. Kenny was 14. That happened several more times. When we were by ourselves, Kenny started calling Pops Crackhead Chris. Like I said, we had a lot to be angry about. Ma and Pops were always fighting like cats and dogs. Pops was still cheating, somehow. Crackheads were in and out of the house. Pops was going back and forth between being a crack smoker and trying to be a crack dealer. When he was dealing, he was always getting beat up for smoking his product up, and we had to watch it all. The one thing that was always solid was the relationship between me and Kenny. By that point, we were 12 and 15. I had friends, and Kenny did too. It was different though. Nobody knew the life we lived. Nobody could identify with what we were going through together. It created a situation where we felt like we had to depend on each other. Well, that's what Kenny would always say. He'd say, "Look, Ken, that friendship stuff is cool, but when it comes down to it, we all we got. We know we got each other. We just guessing about everybody else." I knew Kenny had my back. I didn't doubt that for 1 second. Kenny would let anybody stand in the line, and he would dust them off one by one for me. The name Red Kenny carried some weight for a reason. But what I didn't understand was why Kenny trusted me so much. I never had to defend him. I never had a chance to. Yet, he did trust me, and he made it known to anyone and everyone. A part of me always felt like he did it to make me stronger. He felt like I had his back, so I couldn't let him down. He told everyone that I stood for him when he wasn't around, so I had to stand for him because I couldn't let him down. And when it boiled down to it, we were a team. An unbalanced team, but a team nonetheless. By the time we were 12 and 15, Kenny was a full-blown menace, a 6'2", 190-pound, green-eyed devil. Me and Kenny had both started to get into some stuff, but mine was minor. I had gotten into a couple of scuffles at school, and one time me and my friend Omar got caught breaking into an abandoned building. We ran when we saw the cops. They took us home and told us we weren't even in trouble. We just shouldn't have run, surprisingly. But Kenny, he was on a whole different level. I'm talking school fights, flipping over desks in the classroom, breaking the bus driver's nose, breaking into cars, stealing from stores, you name it. He dropped out of school, and I'm sure his teachers breathed a sigh of relief. Pops told him that he had to get a job if he wasn't going to go to school. Kenny's response? "Nigga, you get a job." By that point, he was a full 40 pounds heavier than Pops. Kenny was 16, and I was 13. Kenny did not get a job. What he did do was start selling drugs. Now, this is the thing. Kenny had seen enough to the point that he should never have wanted to go that way. But on the other side of it, life was getting hard. Ma was spending more and more of her money getting Pops out of his pinches. And according to Kenny, he didn't want to be a part of Ma's financial problems. He ate and slept at the apartment, but he didn't want Ma to feel responsible for him. As an adult, I now realize how crazy that was. Kenny was a 16-year-old child. An adult had a responsibility to feel responsible for him. But in Kenny's 16-year-old mind, Pops was creating enough of a burden, so he didn't want to make it worse. But he did make things worse. Kenny could have gone to anybody to score from, but who did he go to? Rob. Yeah, the same Rob that pummeled Pops on a Wednesday night. I asked Kenny why he did that, and his answer was simple. He's the only person I know that sold drugs, and he took a chance on Pops. If he took a chance on that nigga, I figured he'd take a chance on me. But looking back at it, I think Rob had to have seen something in Kenny. After all, Rob beat Pops with a gun at our kitchen table, and Kenny watched it all. He never even stopped chewing. Things changed between me and Kenny after that point. Nothing happened. We didn't have a falling out or anything. It was just different. For one thing, there was an obvious difference in our ages for the first time. It felt different than being 9 and 12. At 13 and 16, our interests were wildly different. I was still a kid. I wanted to go outside and play. Kenny was 16, and he was into something that I wasn't into, girls. And when I say he was into girls, I mean he was into them, if you know what I mean. You gotta understand how everything was set up. We lived in a pretty small area. It wasn't in the country like where Grandma lived, but it was only about 20 minutes away. It was a small town, but we were a populated area, if that makes sense. Everybody kind of knew everybody, or at the very least, they knew of the person's existence. There was never anybody new coming into that area, so reputations were everything. It was 1991, and Kenny was it. In a town of regular black folks, he was a tall, light-skinned dude with curly brown hair and greenish-gray eyes. Ma always made sure that we were dressed nicely, but when Kenny started selling drugs, he ain't cut no corners with either of us. He made sure that we both had the best of everything. None of the dudes wanted to see Kenny coming, but he was popular with the ladies. I mean, he was a smooth talker. Kenny was hitting everything that was walking. Kenny got real close to Rob, and that created even more issues between him and Pops. Pops hated Rob. He was still doing his occasional drug selling thing, but he wasn't selling for Rob. Pops kept telling Kenny that Rob couldn't be trusted. Kenny always joked it off by telling Pops that he was going to have Rob come and beat him up again. Being honest, Kenny felt like Pops was just jealous, and I can't say that he didn't have a valid point. Growing up, Pops always made Kenny felt like he was nothing special. But then Rob showed up and started acting like a dad to Kenny. No kidding. He was taking Kenny to football games and everything. Pops and Kenny always bumped heads, but he lost all control of Kenny when Rob showed up. Rob would come and knock on our door and say, "Tell Kenny to come on." Kenny would walk right past Pops without even asking if he could go out. He was 16 years old. And when the amusement of that wore off, Rob bought Kenny a car. It was a brand new 1991 Honda Accord with rims and everything. I'll never forget the day that Kenny came home with that car. He drove up while me and Pops were outside. He walked past Pops and said, "Rob said don't ask to drive my car." He laughed and walked into the apartment. Pops was hot. And that's just how things went for a while. Kenny was out a little more than he was in. Pops couldn't control him, and Ma didn't even try to. I missed Kenny. He still lived there, but not really full time. Even when he was there, it wasn't the same. We were all growing further apart. It was like Ma didn't even care what Pops did anymore. He'd stay out for days at a time, and Ma didn't have it in her to argue about it anymore. I guess it's good that they weren't fist fighting and such, but it was obvious that nobody cared about anything. I didn't even have a curfew. Nobody asked where I was going or where I had been. I had a girlfriend that lived 3 doors down. One time, I spent 2 days at her house while her parents were out of town. When I came home, nobody said a thing. It was just a new standard in the house. The only rule that really existed stood between me and Kenny. Wednesdays were reserved for us. I skipped school and everything. It was Kenny's way of making sure that we didn't completely disconnect. There was never really a plan. We just did whatever we wanted. Some days we'd go to an arcade or to the movies. Other days, we'd just hang out. Kenny had a little dirt path out in the country where he used to take girls to. Sometimes we'd just go out there and hang out. I smoked weed for the first time on that dirt path, with Kenny, of course. He obviously had a lot of experience. I didn't, and he found it hilarious. I was 14. Kenny was 17. Those were the days. Thank you so much for listening. Please follow me on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Please like and follow this podcast, and feel free to share it with family, friends, and frenemies, because all relationships matter, even the toxic ones. Thanks so much for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.